There are moments in life when everything you believe about your future changes in a single afternoon. Sometimes it happens because of a tragedy. Sometimes it happens because of a betrayal. And sometimes it happens because the people who think they have won discover they were never playing the game they thought they were. On a cold afternoon in Ohio, 18-year-old Ethan Carter stood on the front porch of the house where he had spent nearly his entire life. In his left hand was a black trash bag filled with clothes. In his right hand was another bag containing a few photo albums, some books, and the last pieces of a childhood he wasn't ready to leave behind. The front door was open, but he wasn't being invited inside. Instead, the man standing in the doorway was making it very clear that Ethan would never be welcome there again. That man was Richard Monroe. The person standing beside him was Richard's new wife, Vanessa. Neither one of them looked guilty. Neither one of them looked concerned. In fact, they looked relieved, as if they had been waiting for this day for years. Richard folded his arms and stared directly at Ethan. "You're 18 now," he said. "You're an adult. It's time to figure things out on your own." Ethan could barely believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just any house. This was his mother's house. The house she had worked for. The house where she had raised him. The house where every memory of her still lived. Yet somehow, on the very day he turned 18, he was being thrown out of it. The worst part wasn't the cold. It wasn't the embarrassment of neighbors watching from across the street. It wasn't even the fear of not knowing where he would sleep that night. The worst part was realizing that the people standing in front of him had planned this. This wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't an argument that got out of control. This was something they had been counting down toward. What Richard and Vanessa didn't know was that somewhere across town, another countdown had already reached 0. And unlike theirs, this one wasn't going to end in celebration. It was going to end in disaster. Because for years, Ethan's grandparents had been waiting for his 18th birthday too. Not because they wanted to throw him out, because they wanted to hand him everything, including the very house Richard believed belonged to him. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first glance, Ethan Carter's life looked ordinary. He wasn't rich. He wasn't popular. He wasn't the kind of person people talked about when discussing future success stories. He was simply a quiet young man trying to make sense of a life that had become increasingly complicated after losing the most important person in the world to him, his mother, Sarah Carter. To understand how everything unfolded, we have to go back nearly 10 years. Back to a time when Ethan still believed families stayed together. Back to a time before lawyers, secrets, hidden documents, and betrayal entered the picture. Back when Sarah Carter was the center of Ethan's world. Sarah was the type of mother everyone wished they had. She worked long hours. She rarely spent money on herself. She put Ethan first in everything she did. Friends often joked that Sarah's entire life revolved around her son. And honestly, they weren't wrong. After Ethan's biological father left when he was very young, Sarah became both parents at once. She attended every school event, every basketball game, every parent conference, every birthday, every milestone. There were difficult years financially, but Sarah always found a way to make things work. Most importantly, she made Ethan feel safe. And safety is something a child never truly appreciates until it's gone. For years, Sarah and Ethan lived peacefully in the family home she had inherited from her side of the family. The property wasn't a mansion. It wasn't located in an expensive neighborhood, but it carried generations of memories. Sarah's parents, William and Margaret Carter, often reminded Ethan that some things were worth more than money. Family was one of those things. Trust was another. At the time, Ethan didn't understand why his grandparents repeated those lessons so often. Years later, he would understand perfectly. When Ethan was 9 years old, Sarah met Richard Monroe. At first, Richard seemed like the answer to every problem. He was charming, successful, confident. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to act, and exactly how to make people feel comfortable around him. Sarah's friends loved him. Neighbors praised him. Even Ethan slowly began trusting him. Richard attended school events, helped around the house, fixed things that were broken, and for a while, he genuinely appeared to care about the family he was joining. Looking back, Ethan would later wonder whether any of it had been real, or whether Richard had simply been very good at pretending. Because while most people welcomed Richard into their lives, there were two people who never fully trusted him: William and Margaret Carter, Ethan's grandparents. and they had reasons nobody else knew about. William and Margaret Carter were not the type of people who made accusations without evidence. They had spent most of their lives building a reputation for honesty, discipline, and careful judgment. William had owned a successful construction company before retiring, while Margaret had spent decades working as a school administrator. Together, they had learned how to read people well. They understood that first impressions could be misleading, and they believed that a person's true character eventually revealed itself through consistent actions over time. That was why their concerns about Richard never came from a single event. It was dozens of little things. Small details. Moments that most people ignored. Richard always seemed interested in financial discussions. Whenever family gatherings took place, conversations somehow drifted toward property values, investments, inheritance planning, or future assets. He asked questions that seemed harmless on the surface, but William noticed how carefully Richard listened whenever money became the topic. Margaret noticed something else. Whenever Sarah talked about Ethan's future, Richard would become unusually quiet. Not angry, not upset, just quiet. As if he were calculating something. As if he were filing information away for later. Still, Sarah appeared happy. And because she was happy, her parents tried to give Richard the benefit of the doubt. Years passed. Richard and Sarah married. Life settled into a routine. For a while, everything appeared normal. Ethan entered his teenage years. School became more demanding. Friends became more important. The ordinary challenges of growing up occupied most of his attention. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, changes were beginning to take place inside the family that Ethan never noticed. Richard slowly became involved in more of Sarah's financial affairs. At first it seemed reasonable. Married couples often share responsibilities. He helped organize bills, managed household paperwork, handled insurance renewals, reviewed taxes. Nothing about it seemed unusual. In fact, many people would have considered it responsible. But William noticed that Richard's involvement kept expanding. Every year, he gained access to more information, more accounts, more documents, more control. One evening, during a family dinner, William casually asked Sarah whether she still kept the original property documents in her personal safe. Before Sarah could answer, Richard answered for her. "We reorganized all that paperwork months ago." William smiled politely, but internally, alarms began ringing. The question had been directed at Sarah. Yet Richard answered immediately, as though he considered the matter his responsibility, or perhaps his possession. That night, William discussed the situation with Margaret. For the first time, they openly admitted something neither had wanted to say. They didn't trust Richard. Not completely. Not with Sarah. And certainly not with Ethan's future. Unfortunately, they had no proof of anything. Only instincts. And instincts alone weren't enough. Then something happened that changed everything. Sarah became sick. It started with what seemed like minor health problems. Fatigue, headaches, frequent doctor appointments. At first, everyone assumed stress was the cause. Sarah had always worked hard. She rarely rested. Naturally, people expected her health to improve. Instead, it worsened. Months passed. Medical tests increased. Specialists became involved. The atmosphere inside the Carter family changed. Suddenly, every conversation carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. Ethan was only 15 years old when he realized his mother wasn't getting better. He remembered sitting beside her one evening while she rested on the couch. The television was playing quietly in the background. Neither of them were really watching it. Sarah looked exhausted, far more exhausted than she wanted her son to notice. Then she reached over and squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "I need you to remember something." Ethan immediately felt fear. Children always know when adults are trying to hide something. "What?" he asked. Sarah smiled. The same warm smile she had given him since childhood. "You are stronger than you think." At the time, Ethan didn't understand why she said it. Years later, those words would echo in his mind. Because Sarah knew things Ethan didn't. Things she wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. As her condition worsened, Sarah began meeting privately with William and Margaret more frequently. The meetings often happened without Richard present. Sometimes they occurred at her parents' house. Sometimes at restaurants. Sometimes in places where nobody would expect them. Richard noticed. Of course he noticed. And he didn't like it. One evening, after Sarah returned from visiting her parents, Richard asked where she had been. The question sounded innocent. But Sarah immediately recognized something beneath it. Suspicion. Control. Curiosity. She answered calmly. Just spending time with my parents. Richard stared at her for several seconds. Then he nodded. The conversation ended. But Sarah never forgot the look in his eyes. A few weeks later, she requested a private meeting with a lawyer. Not a family lawyer. Not someone Richard knew. Someone entirely independent. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When she returned home, she appeared emotionally exhausted, yet strangely relieved, as though she had finally completed something important, something necessary. The details of that meeting remained secret. For years, nobody knew what happened inside that office. Not Ethan. Not Richard. Not Vanessa. Nobody. What nobody realized was that a series of documents had just been prepared. Documents that would remain hidden until a very specific date. A very specific birthday. And a very specific young man became legally entitled to see them. The following year brought even more challenges. Sarah's condition continued deteriorating. Hospital visits became common. Family gatherings became quieter. Conversations became shorter. Laughter became less frequent. Everyone understood the reality they were facing. Even Ethan. But there was something strange happening during this period. The sicker Sarah became, the more interested Richard seemed in financial matters. He asked detailed questions about insurance, retirement accounts, property taxes, investment records, legal documents. At first glance, these were practical concerns. Any spouse might ask similar questions. But combined with everything William and Margaret had already observed, the pattern felt troubling. Then came the day that permanently changed the course of everyone's lives. A day Ethan would remember forever. A day that shattered his world. And a day that secretly set Richard Monroe on a path toward the biggest mistake he would ever make. Because Sarah Carter's time was running out. And before she left this world, she made one final decision. A decision that would remain hidden for years. A decision designed specifically to protect her son. A decision that would eventually turn Richard's victory into a complete nightmare. But before that happened, Ethan would first have to lose everything he thought he had left. The final months of Sarah Carter's life felt unreal. For Ethan, time seemed to move in strange ways. Some days passed so quickly that he barely noticed them. Other days felt endless. Every hospital visit carried hope that things might improve, followed by disappointment when doctors delivered the same cautious updates. Family members tried to remain optimistic, but deep down everyone understood the truth. Sarah was fighting a battle she could not win. Through it all, she remained focused on Ethan. Even on her worst days, she asked about his grades, his friends, his plans for the future, his dreams. Sometimes Ethan wondered how she could worry about him when she was the one suffering. But that was who Sarah was. She had always placed her son before herself. One afternoon, several weeks before her death, Sarah asked Ethan to sit beside her on the back porch. It was one of her favorite places. The same porch where she had watched him ride his first bicycle. The same porch where she had helped him with homework. The same porch where they had spent countless summer evenings talking about life. The sun was beginning to set. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then Sarah broke the silence. Promise me something. Ethan immediately felt nervous. What is it? Promise me you'll never let anyone tell you what you're worth. He frowned. What do you mean? Sarah looked out across the yard. People will try to define you. They'll tell you what you deserve. They'll tell you what you can have and what you can't have. They'll tell you who you are. Don't let them. Ethan nodded. At the time, he assumed she was giving general advice. Looking back, he realized she was trying to prepare him, trying to warn him, trying to protect him in the only way she still could. A few days later, Sarah arranged another private meeting. This time it wasn't with her parents. And it wasn't with Ethan. It was with attorney Daniel Brooks. The meeting took place behind closed doors. No one else attended. When she emerged several hours later, she carried a sealed envelope. She handed it directly to Daniel. Then she made him promise something. The envelope would remain sealed until Ethan's 18th birthday. No exceptions. No matter what happened. No matter who asked. No matter how much pressure anyone applied. Daniel agreed. The envelope disappeared into a secured vault. And with that, Sarah's final preparations were complete. Weeks later, she passed away. The news devastated everyone. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. The person who had always been there was suddenly gone. The house felt different. The neighborhood felt different. Even the air seemed different. For months, Ethan struggled to process the loss. Some mornings he woke up expecting to hear his mother's voice. Then reality returned all over again. The grief never arrived all at once. It came in waves. Unexpected moments. A favorite song. A family photograph. A scent that reminded him of her. Every small reminder reopened the wound. William and Margaret suffered deeply as well. No parent expects to outlive their child. The pain was unbearable. Yet despite their grief, they remained focused on Ethan. More than ever, they worried about his future. And unfortunately, their concerns soon proved justified. At first, Richard appeared supportive. He comforted Ethan, attended school meetings, handled household responsibilities. To outsiders, he looked like a devoted stepfather trying to help a grieving teenager. For a while, Ethan believed it too. Then subtle changes began. Small at first, almost impossible to notice. Richard became less patient, less kind, less interested in Ethan's life. Conversations grew shorter. Family dinners became rare. The warmth that once existed between them slowly disappeared. Months passed. Then one day Richard announced he had started seeing someone. The timing shocked everyone, especially Ethan. It hadn't even been a year since Sarah's death. Yet Richard was already moving forward. William and Margaret were stunned. But what happened next shocked them even more. The relationship progressed rapidly. Far too rapidly. Within months, the woman was spending significant time at the house. Her name was Vanessa Blake. Vanessa was attractive, confident, and extremely ambitious. She carried herself as though every room belonged to her the moment she entered it. From the beginning, Ethan felt uncomfortable around her. Not because she was openly rude, at least not initially. It was something harder to explain. A feeling, an instinct. The same kind of instinct his grandparents had experienced years earlier with Richard. Vanessa treated Ethan politely in public. But there was always something cold underneath her smile. Something calculating, as if she were evaluating him, measuring his importance, determining whether he was useful. Unfortunately for Ethan, her conclusion seemed obvious. He wasn't. As Vanessa's presence increased, changes inside the house accelerated. The first thing to disappear was Sarah's favorite chair, then family photographs, then decorations, then keepsakes. Little by little, traces of Sarah vanished. Each time Ethan noticed something missing, Richard offered a simple explanation. We're updating the house. We're reorganizing. We need a fresh start. Fresh start. Those two words became Richard's favorite phrase. But to Ethan, it didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like an erasure, as though someone was systematically removing every memory of his mother. One evening, Ethan returned from school and discovered several boxes stacked near the garage. Inside were family belongings, photo albums, old decorations, personal items that had belonged to Sarah. He stared at them in disbelief. Many carried emotional significance. Some were irreplaceable. When he confronted Richard, the response stunned him. We don't need all that clutter. Clutter. That was how Richard described the memories of the woman who had built the family. That was the moment something changed inside Ethan. For the first time, he began questioning everything. His trust, his assumptions, his understanding of the man he had known for years. And the more he watched Richard, the more disturbing things became. Vanessa moved into the house permanently. Soon afterward, she began acting less like a guest and more like an owner. She rearranged rooms, changed furniture, made decisions without consulting Ethan. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place he happened to sleep. Meanwhile, William and Margaret observed everything. They remained patient, quiet, watchful, because unlike Ethan, they knew something important. Something Richard didn't know. The plan Sarah created years earlier was still in motion. Every document remained secure. Every legal safeguard remained intact. Every instruction remained enforceable. The only thing left was time. Specifically, one date. Ethan's 18th birthday. That single day would determine everything. Unfortunately, Ethan knew nothing about it. As his 18th birthday approached, life became increasingly difficult. Richard and Vanessa grew more distant, more controlling, more hostile. Sometimes Ethan overheard conversations that abruptly ended when he entered the room. Sometimes he caught them discussing future renovations, future plans, future ownership. One night, he heard Vanessa laughing. After 18, everything becomes much easier. Richard laughed too. Neither realized Ethan was standing nearby. Neither realized he had heard every word. That conversation haunted him for weeks. Because deep down, he began fearing that something was coming. Something neither Richard nor Vanessa wanted him to know about. And for once, Ethan's instincts were absolutely correct. Because while he worried about what might happen after his 18th birthday, Richard and Vanessa were already counting down the days until they could finally get rid of him. What they didn't realize was that someone else was counting down too. Someone waiting patiently for the exact same date. Someone holding documents capable of destroying everything Richard believed belonged to him. And the countdown was almost over. The final weeks before Ethan's 18th birthday felt different. Even though nobody openly discussed it, there was a strange tension hanging over the house. Ethan couldn't fully explain it, but he sensed it every day. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Richard and Vanessa exchanged looks they thought he didn't notice. There were whispered discussions behind closed doors. Phone calls that ended the moment he walked nearby. Every instinct told him something important was coming. Unfortunately, he had no idea just how right he was. By that point, the house no longer felt like home. The walls still looked familiar. The rooms still contained pieces of his childhood. But emotionally, everything had changed. Sarah's presence had almost completely disappeared. The family photographs that once lined the hallway were gone. Her favorite decorations had vanished. Even the scent of the house seemed different. It felt as though Richard and Vanessa were slowly rewriting history, as though Sarah had never existed. One evening, Ethan arrived home from school and found Vanessa sitting at the dining room table with several papers spread out in front of her. She quickly gathered them when she noticed him. The reaction seemed odd, almost nervous. Ethan caught a brief glimpse before she moved them. Property records, tax documents, insurance forms, legal paperwork. When Vanessa realized he had noticed, she forced a smile. Nothing important. But Ethan knew better. People rarely hide things that aren't important. The incident stayed in his mind. Later that night, he mentioned it to his grandparents during a phone call. The silence on the other end lasted longer than usual. Finally, William spoke. Just focus on finishing school. The answer surprised Ethan. His grandfather usually gave direct advice. This response felt different. Careful, measured, as though he wanted to say more but couldn't. Margaret then joined the conversation. No matter what happens, remember that you're not alone. Again, the statement seemed unusual. No matter what happens. Why would she say that? At the time, Ethan assumed they were simply worried about him. Years later, he would realize they already knew a storm was approaching, and they were preparing for it. The days continued passing, one after another. Then came the week before Ethan's birthday. Richard suddenly became friendlier. Not genuinely friendly. Artificially friendly. Like a salesman trying to close a deal. He asked more questions. Started more conversations. Acted unusually interested in Ethan's plans after graduation. The behavior felt strange, especially considering how distant he had been for the previous 2 years. Vanessa behaved similarly. For a brief period, she even attempted small talk. The sudden change made Ethan uncomfortable, because people don't usually transform overnight, especially not people who have spent years showing you exactly who they are. A few days before his birthday, Ethan overheard another conversation. This one changed everything. He had gone downstairs late at night to get a drink. As he approached the kitchen, he heard Richard speaking. Just a few more days. Vanessa laughed. I've been waiting for this forever. Richard sounded relieved. After Friday, none of it will be our problem anymore. Ethan froze. Neither of them knew he was there. Neither realized he was listening. Vanessa lowered her voice. Are you sure everything's ready? Richard answered immediately. Absolutely. The confidence in his voice sent a chill through Ethan. He quietly returned upstairs. Sleep never came that night. His mind replayed the conversation repeatedly. What exactly was happening on Friday? Why were they waiting so eagerly? Why did it involve him? The questions followed him everywhere. School, work, home. By the time his birthday finally arrived, Ethan felt physically sick from anxiety. He woke up expecting at least a small acknowledgement. A simple birthday greeting. Maybe breakfast. Maybe a card. Maybe some sign that turning 18 mattered. Instead, the house was silent. No decorations. No celebration. Nothing. The day passed like any other. Richard barely spoke. Vanessa spent most of the afternoon on her phone. The atmosphere felt strangely cold. Then, around 6 o'clock that evening, Richard asked Ethan to come downstairs. Immediately, Ethan felt nervous. Something about Richard's tone felt wrong. Too formal. Too prepared. When Ethan entered the living room, Richard and Vanessa were already waiting. Several large trash bags sat near the front door. At first, Ethan assumed they contained old clothes or donations. Then he recognized some of the items visible through the plastic. His belongings, his clothes, his books, his possessions. Confusion immediately turned into alarm. "What is this?" he asked. Richard took a deep breath. The performance almost looked rehearsed. "You're 18 now." Ethan stared at him. "So?" Richard folded his arms. "So you're an adult." The room suddenly felt smaller. Vanessa remained silent. Watching. Waiting. Richard continued. "That means it's time for you to move out." For several seconds, Ethan couldn't process what he had heard. The words didn't seem real. Move out? Today? On his birthday? He laughed nervously, assuming it had to be a joke. But nobody laughed with him. Nobody smiled. Nobody corrected him. The reality began sinking in. They were serious. Completely serious. "You can't be serious." Richard's expression never changed. "We've discussed this." "No, we haven't. We've hinted at it for years." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "This is my home." Vanessa finally spoke. "No, it isn't." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. "No," she repeated. "It's Richard's house." Richard nodded in agreement. "And now that you're legally an adult, it's time to take responsibility for yourself." Ethan felt anger rising. "So you're throwing me out?" Richard didn't answer immediately, because he didn't need to. The trash bags answered for him. The packed belongings answered for him. The expression on Vanessa's face answered for him. They had planned this. Every detail, every step, every moment. For years. Ethan looked around the room where his mother once sat, the room where birthdays had been celebrated, the room filled with memories. Now it felt like a stranger's house. Richard pointed toward the door. "You need to leave." Ethan's chest tightened. "Where am I supposed to go?" Richard shrugged. "You're an adult. Figure it out." The cruelty of the response stunned him. This was the man who once attended his basketball games. The man who once called himself family. The man his mother trusted. And now he was standing there treating Ethan like an inconvenience. Like a problem that needed removing. Within 30 minutes, it was over. His belongings sat outside. The locks were changed. The front door closed. And Ethan found himself standing alone on the sidewalk. Several neighbors watched from a distance. Some looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. Nobody seemed to understand what they were witnessing. Neither did Ethan. His entire world had collapsed in less than an hour. As darkness approached, fear began replacing anger. Where would he sleep? What would he do? Who could he call? Then his phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it. But nothing about that day was normal. He answered. "Hello." A calm professional voice replied. "Is this Ethan Carter?" "Yes. My name is Daniel Brooks." The name meant nothing to Ethan. At least not yet. "I'm an attorney." Ethan frowned. An attorney? Why would a lawyer be calling him? The next sentence changed everything. "I've been trying to reach you for quite some time." Ethan's heart began racing. What is this about? There was a brief pause. Then Daniel Brooks delivered the words that would completely alter the course of Ethan's life. "It's about your mother." And suddenly, for the first time all day, hope appeared. For a moment, Ethan forgot about the cold. He forgot about the trash bag sitting beside him. He forgot about the house. The only thing he could focus on was the final sentence Daniel Brooks had spoken. "It's about your mother." His heart immediately began racing. Questions flooded his mind. How did this lawyer know his mother? Why was he calling now? Why had he never heard of him before? And most importantly, what could possibly be so important that it couldn't wait? Ethan tightened his grip on the phone. "What about my mother?" Daniel's voice remained calm and professional. "I would prefer to discuss everything in person." Ethan glanced back toward the house. The same house he had been thrown out of less than an hour earlier. The same house where Richard and Vanessa were probably celebrating their victory. At that moment, Ethan felt he had nothing left to lose. Immediately, the answer came without hesitation. Daniel continued. "I've been instructed to meet with you on your 18th birthday. Not before. Not after. Today." Ethan's stomach tightened. There was something significant about that sentence. Something deliberate. Someone had specifically chosen this date. Someone had planned this years ago. "Who instructed you?" Ethan asked. The lawyer paused, then answered. "Your mother." For several seconds, Ethan couldn't speak. His mother. His mother had arranged this. Years earlier. Before she died. Before Richard changed. Before Vanessa arrived. Before everything fell apart. Suddenly, the events of the day felt different. As though pieces of a puzzle were beginning to move into place. Daniel gave Ethan the office address. 45 minutes later, Ethan arrived carrying the same 2 trash bags that contained everything he owned. The law office occupied part of an older brick building downtown. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't impressive. But it felt serious, permanent, important. The receptionist greeted Ethan immediately, almost as if they had been expecting him. Within minutes, he was escorted into a conference room. Daniel Brooks was already waiting. He appeared to be in his late 50s. Gray hair, sharp suit, calm demeanor. The kind of person who seemed completely comfortable handling complicated situations. As Ethan entered, Daniel stood and extended his hand. "Happy birthday, Ethan." The words felt strange considering how the day had gone. Ethan sat down. "I don't understand any of this." Daniel nodded. "That's understandable." Then he reached into a locked briefcase. What he removed immediately captured Ethan's attention. A thick sealed envelope. The seal remained intact, untouched. Daniel carefully placed it on the table. "This was prepared by your mother." Ethan stared at it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Sarah Carter. His mother's handwriting. The sight alone nearly broke him. For a moment, it felt like she was in the room. Daniel spoke quietly. "This envelope has remained sealed for nearly 3 years." Ethan swallowed hard. "Why?" "Because your mother instructed that it could only be opened on your 18th birthday." The reality of that statement hit him like a wave. 3 years. His mother had planned something 3 years ago. Something so important that she built legal protections around it. Daniel carefully opened the envelope. Several documents emerged, along with a handwritten letter. Ethan immediately recognized his mother's writing. His hands trembled. Daniel looked at him. "There are several things you need to know." The room became completely silent. Then Daniel began. "First, your mother anticipated the possibility that certain people might attempt to control assets after her death." Ethan immediately thought of Richard. Daniel continued. "Because of those concerns, she established a trust." A trust. Ethan had heard the word before, but never paid much attention to it. Now it suddenly felt important. Very important. What kind of trust? Daniel slid a document across the table. A protected family trust. Ethan stared at the paperwork. Legal terminology filled multiple pages. Most of it made little sense. Daniel noticed the confusion, so he simplified it. Your mother transferred ownership of several assets into the trust before her death. Ethan frowned. What assets? Daniel looked directly at him. The house. Everything stopped. For a moment, Ethan thought he had misunderstood. The house. Daniel nodded. Yes. Ethan blinked. But Richard said. I know what Richard said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. And Richard was wrong. A chill ran through Ethan. The lawyer opened another file. Inside were certified property records, ownership documents, trust agreements, signatures, official filings, years of legal paperwork. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The house did not belong to Richard Monroe. Not now. Not then. Not ever. Ethan struggled to process what he was hearing. You're saying he never owned it? Daniel nodded. Correct. What about after my mother died? The trust remained active. What does that mean? It means ownership remained protected exactly as your mother intended. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Then Daniel delivered the sentence that changed everything. The legal owner of the property, as of today, is you. Silence filled the room. Ethan simply stared, unable to respond, unable to think, unable to breathe. After everything that had happened, after being thrown out, after losing his home, after believing he had nowhere to go, the truth was almost impossible to comprehend. The house belonged to him. Not Richard. Not Vanessa. Him. Daniel allowed the information to settle. Then he continued. And that's only part of what your mother protected. He opened another folder. More documents. More records. More surprises. Investment accounts. Trust funds. Insurance proceeds. Long-term financial assets. Everything carefully organized. Everything legally secured. Everything protected from interference. Ethan stared at page after page. His mother had planned for years. She had anticipated problems. She had anticipated risks. She had anticipated people she couldn't fully trust. And she had built safeguards around everything. Daniel finally slid the handwritten letter across the table. This is from your mother. The room suddenly felt smaller, more emotional, more personal. Slowly, Ethan unfolded the letter. The first line immediately brought tears to his eyes. If you're reading this, my sweet boy, it means you've reached your 18th birthday. His vision blurred. For several moments, he couldn't continue. Daniel respectfully remained silent. Eventually, Ethan kept reading. Your grandparents and I have worked very hard to protect your future. If certain events unfolded the way I feared they might, this letter would explain everything. I hope I was wrong. More than anything, I hope you never had to experience the pain that led you to this moment. Tears rolled down Ethan's face. Every word sounded exactly like her. Every sentence felt familiar, like hearing her voice again after years of silence. Then came the passage that changed everything. I love you more than words can ever express. And because I love you, I refuse to leave your future in the hands of uncertainty. If you are reading this, then everything now belongs to you exactly as intended. Everything. Daniel waited until Ethan finished reading. Then he opened one final file. This contains possession orders. Ethan looked up. What does that mean? It means Richard Monroe no longer has any legal right to occupy your property. The words landed like thunder. For years, Richard had acted like the owner. For years, he had treated Ethan like an unwanted guest. For years, he had planned for this birthday, only to discover he had been wrong the entire time. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The legal process can begin immediately. For the first time that day, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Control, hope, justice. And somewhere across town, inside the house he believed he had finally secured for himself, Richard Monroe had absolutely no idea that his world was about to collapse. Because the house he thought he owned never belonged to him at all. The morning after Ethan's 18th birthday began very differently for him than it did for Richard Monroe. For the first time in months, Ethan woke up feeling something other than fear. The previous day had started with humiliation, rejection, betrayal, but it had ended with answers. Answers his mother had carefully protected for years. Answers that completely changed the situation. Meanwhile, Richard woke up believing he had won. He believed Ethan was gone. He believed the house belonged to him. He believed the future was secure. What he didn't know was that several legal documents were already moving through the system, and every one of them carried the potential to destroy the life he thought he had built. Later that morning, Daniel Brooks began executing the instructions Sarah Carter had put in place years earlier. The trust documents were activated. Ownership records were updated. Notices were prepared. Possession demands were finalized. Every step followed the law exactly. Every document had been carefully crafted years before. Sarah had left nothing to chance. She had anticipated resistance. She had anticipated arguments. She had anticipated manipulation. And she had made sure the legal foundation was solid enough to withstand all of it. Shortly after noon, a process server arrived at the house. Richard was sitting in the living room when the knock came. Vanessa was in the kitchen. Neither expected anything unusual. The process server introduced himself, then handed Richard a thick envelope. At first, Richard appeared annoyed. That annoyance quickly turned into confusion, then disbelief, then panic, because the very first page carried words he never expected to see. Notice of property ownership claim. Richard frowned. He continued reading. The color immediately drained from his face. Vanessa noticed. What is it? Richard didn't answer. He kept reading. Page after page. Document after document. Every line made the situation worse. By the time he reached the final page, his hands were visibly shaking. Vanessa snatched the paperwork. Her confidence disappeared almost immediately. This can't be real. But it was. Every page was real. Every signature was real. Every legal filing was real. Most importantly, every document carried the same devastating conclusion. The house belonged to Ethan Carter. Not Richard Monroe. Not Vanessa Blake. Ethan Carter. Vanessa reread the documents multiple times, as though repetition might somehow change reality. It didn't. The truth remained exactly the same. Richard had spent years treating the property as his own, years planning renovations, years imagining his future there, years believing he controlled everything. And now a stack of papers had destroyed that illusion in less than 10 minutes. Vanessa looked at Richard. You told me the house was yours. Richard struggled to respond. That's what I believed. What do you mean that's what you believe? I mean that's what Sarah led me to believe. Vanessa slammed the documents onto the table. No, you said you knew. The argument escalated quickly. Years of frustration suddenly surfaced. Accusations flew across the room. Blame shifted back and forth. Neither wanted responsibility. Neither wanted accountability. Most importantly, neither wanted to admit they had made a catastrophic mistake. Because throwing Ethan out suddenly looked very different. Had they simply allowed him to remain in the house, they might have had time to process the situation, time to negotiate, time to prepare. Instead, they had publicly removed the legal owner from his own property. And now there was documentation proving it. The following days became a nightmare. Additional notices arrived. Deadlines were established. Meetings were scheduled. Legal consequences became increasingly clear. Richard contacted attorneys. Several. Each gave him essentially the same answer. The trust appeared valid. The ownership records appeared valid. The filings appeared valid. And the chances of overturning them were extremely small. Every conversation ended with the same unpleasant reality. The house was not his. Never had been. Word spread through the neighborhood surprisingly fast. Neighbors who had witnessed Ethan being thrown out began learning the truth. Many were shocked. Others were furious. Some felt guilty for not intervening. People who had previously remained silent suddenly started sharing stories. Stories about Richard's behavior. Stories about Vanessa. Stories about things that had seemed unusual over the years. One neighbor recalled seeing family photographs being discarded. Another remembered hearing arguments. Another described how differently Richard behaved after Sarah's death. The community's opinion shifted dramatically. The sympathy Richard once enjoyed disappeared almost overnight. Meanwhile, Ethan remained focused. Guided by Daniel Brooks and supported by his grandparents, he followed every legal step carefully. There was no desire for revenge, no interest in public humiliation, only a determination to reclaim what his mother had intended him to have. Still, emotions remained complicated, because despite everything, the house represented more than property. It represented Sarah, her memories, her sacrifices, her love, and that made the situation deeply personal. 1 week later, the moment finally arrived. The final possession notice had expired. Richard and Vanessa were required to vacate the property. Failure to comply would trigger additional legal action. The date had been set. The paperwork completed. Everything was ready. As Ethan's vehicle approached the neighborhood, his heart pounded. He hadn't been back since the night he was thrown out. The sight of the house immediately triggered memories. Good memories. Painful memories. Childhood memories. All mixed together. William and Margaret accompanied him. Neither spoke much during the drive. The significance of the moment didn't require words. When they arrived, several neighbors quietly watched from their homes. News of the situation had traveled quickly. People understood something important was happening. Richard's vehicle remained in the driveway. So did Vanessa's. But activity was visible inside. Boxes. Movement. Packing. The reality of their situation had finally become unavoidable. Ethan stepped out of the car. For several seconds, he simply stared at the house. The same house his mother had fought to protect. The same house where he had grown up. The same house from which he had been removed. Now he was returning. Not as a guest. Not as a dependent. Not as an unwanted burden. But as the rightful owner. The front door opened. Richard emerged first. He looked exhausted. Older. Defeated. The confidence that once defined him had vanished. Vanessa followed shortly afterward. Her expression carried frustration rather than regret. Several tense seconds passed. Nobody spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. I didn't know. Ethan looked at him. The statement sounded almost absurd. Years of behavior. Years of arrogance. Years of assumptions. Reduced to 3 words. I didn't know. Ethan answered calmly. You never bothered finding out. Richard lowered his eyes. For once, he had no response. Because the statement was true. He had assumed. Expected. Taken things for granted. And now he was paying the price. Vanessa stepped forward. This isn't fair. William Carter immediately responded. His voice remained calm but firm. Fair. The single word stopped her. William continued. Fair would have been honoring Sarah's wishes. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Because deep down, everyone understood the truth. Sarah's wishes had always been clear. Protect Ethan. Protect his future. Protect what belonged to him. And despite years of manipulation, her plan had succeeded. The moving truck departed later that afternoon. Richard and Vanessa left with it. Neither looked back. Neither received sympathy from the crowd of neighbors quietly observing. Their chapter in the house was over. Completely over. As silence settled across the property, Ethan slowly walked toward the front door. The same door that had been closed in his face. The same door that had symbolized rejection only days earlier. Now it stood open, waiting. He stepped inside. Emotion immediately overwhelmed him. Because although many things had changed, one thing never had. The house had always been his mother's gift. And thanks to her foresight, determination, and love, it had finally found its way home. Yet there was still one final surprise waiting. One final secret Sarah Carter had prepared years ago. A secret hidden inside a second envelope. A secret that would leave everyone speechless, including Ethan himself. Here's the final part that concludes the entire story and provides the emotional payoff your audience will remember. The house was quiet again. For the first time in years, it felt like it belonged to the family that had built it. As evening settled outside, Ethan walked slowly through each room. Every step brought back memories. Some were joyful, some were painful, some were so vivid that he could almost hear his mother's voice echoing through the halls. The kitchen where she helped him with homework. The living room where they watched movies together. The hallway where she measured his height every birthday. For years, those memories had felt threatened. Now they felt protected, restored. As Ethan moved through the house, William and Margaret remained nearby, allowing him space to process everything. Neither wanted to interrupt the moment. They had waited a long time for this day too, longer than Ethan realized. Eventually, William approached carrying a small wooden box. The box looked old, carefully preserved, almost ceremonial. Ethan frowned. "What is that?" William exchanged a glance with Margaret. Then he gently placed the box on the dining room table. "Something your mother wanted you to have." Immediately, Ethan felt emotion rising inside him. Another surprise. Another piece of Sarah. Another connection to the woman he missed every day. Slowly, he opened the box. Inside was a second sealed envelope. Unlike the first one, this envelope contained only a few words written across the front. "For Ethan, when you finally come home." The sight nearly brought him to tears. His mother had known. Years ago, she had somehow known there would come a day when he would need these words. A day when he would return home after fighting battles she could only imagine. With trembling hands, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, and beneath it was a flash drive. Daniel Brooks smiled softly. "Your mother recorded something before she passed away." Ethan stared at the flash drive. A recorded message. A message preserved for years. Waiting. Protected. Saved for this exact moment. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The room felt frozen in time. Eventually, Ethan connected the drive to a laptop. The screen remained black for a few seconds. Then suddenly she appeared. Sarah Carter. Smiling. Healthy. Alive. The image stole the breath from Ethan's lungs. Years had passed since he had seen her like this. Not sick. Not exhausted. Not struggling. Just his mother. The mother he remembered. The mother he loved. For several seconds, she simply smiled into the camera. Then she began speaking. "Hi, sweetheart." Ethan immediately broke down. Hearing her voice again felt impossible, like receiving a message from another world. Sarah continued, "If you're watching this, then you've reached the day I hoped would come." Tears streamed down Ethan's face. William and Margaret quietly wiped away tears of their own. Sarah smiled. "First, I need you to know something. If life became difficult after I left, none of it was because of you." She paused. "I need you to hear that." The room remained silent except for Sarah's voice. "You have always been the greatest blessing of my life. Every decision I made was because I loved you. Every sacrifice, every plan, every sleepless night." Ethan lowered his head. The emotion was overwhelming. Then Sarah addressed the subject she had clearly spent years thinking about. "I don't know what happened after I was gone. I don't know who stayed loyal and who didn't. I don't know who kept their promises and who broke them." She paused. "But I suspected there might be challenges." The room became still. Sarah continued, "That is why your grandparents and I worked together to protect your future." For years, Ethan had wondered. Now the answers were finally complete. Sarah smiled softly. "William and Margaret have loved you from the day you were born. If you're watching this, then they've probably spent years protecting you in ways you'll never fully understand." Both grandparents immediately began crying. The years of secrecy, the years of waiting, the years of carrying Sarah's burden. All of it suddenly felt worthwhile. Then Sarah said something nobody expected. Something that became the true final twist of the story. "There's one more thing you need to know." Ethan looked up. Sarah reached for a folder beside her. Inside were documents. More documents. More surprises. She smiled again. "Most people think inheritance is about money." She shook her head. "It isn't." Ethan listened carefully. "Money can disappear. Houses can be sold. Possessions can be replaced. Then Sarah placed her hand over her heart. The most valuable inheritance is knowing who you are. The words hung in the air. Powerful. Simple. True. Sarah continued. If you ever face betrayal, don't let it turn you into a bitter person. Ethan immediately thought about Richard, about Vanessa, about everything that had happened. Sarah seemed to anticipate it. People will disappoint you. Some people will hurt you. Some people will choose greed over love. She smiled sadly. But don't become like them. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Sarah delivered her final message. The house was never the real gift. Ethan frowned. For years, everything had seemed centered around the house. The legal battle, the trust, the inheritance, the conflict. Yet Sarah was telling him something different. The real gift, she said, is knowing that you were loved enough for someone to protect your future even after they were gone. Silence filled the room, because everyone understood exactly what she meant. The trust wasn't the gift. The money wasn't the gift. The house wasn't the gift. Her love was the gift. The years of planning were the gift. The protection was the gift. Everything else was simply evidence of it. Sarah looked directly into the camera. If you're standing inside this house while watching this message, then you're home. Ethan broke down completely. The tears came without restraint. Years of grief. Years of confusion. Years of pain. All releasing at once. Then Sarah smiled one final time. I love you, sweetheart. The screen faded to black. The room remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because there was nothing left to say. The message had said everything. Weeks later, life slowly began moving forward. Family photographs returned to the walls. Sarah's belongings returned to their places. The house felt alive again. Not because of ownership documents. Not because of legal victories. But because it once again reflected the family she built. Richard and Vanessa disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. Few people asked about them. Even fewer cared. Their story had ended. Ethan's was just beginning. Over time, he continued his education, managed the property responsibly, built a future his mother would have been proud of. Most importantly, he never forgot the lessons she left behind. Years later, visitors would occasionally ask about the house. And every time, Ethan would tell them the same thing. The house isn't special because I inherited it. He would smile. It's special because my mother never stopped protecting me. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people who think they've won are simply standing at the beginning of their defeat. Sometimes greed blinds people to the truth. Sometimes patience defeats manipulation. And sometimes love continues working long after the person who gave it is gone. So here's a question for you. If you were in Ethan's position, would you have forgiven Richard and Vanessa after everything they did? Or do some betrayals cross a line that can never be repaired? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories of family, betrayal, justice, and unexpected twists. Because the next story may be even more unbelievable than this one.